Hello, I'm Jeff Cavins, and today we're looking at the scriptures for the 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 7, we see stories about raising the dead. Elijah in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament. And both stories really communicate to us that God has the power over death, hell, and the grave. And He has the power to change our lives, and He's involved with our lives. He's not like the Greek gods or the Roman gods that were above the clouds or made fun of us, but He came down and tabernacled among us. He lived with us. And what we find out in today's gospel reading is He reaches out and He physically touches us, and He touches our lives. And we're called to do the same thing. You know, Jesus ministered during a time where there was a leading party called the Pharisees. And the name Pharisee really speaks of the separated ones. And they were a people who separated themselves from the world, and they defined themselves based on what they don't do. And this stems from the Old Testament, where the children of Israel, when they sinned and got into trouble, they ended up with more and more law, separating themselves from neighbors and not allowing them to do certain things because their level of righteousness wasn't strong enough to overcome the evil in the world. But what happened over time in the development of the Pharisaic party is that they began to define themselves in terms of what they can't do or can't touch, and they began to glory in that, or they began to brag about that. It's like when I was a kid and I was growing up and I asked my mom if I could sleep over at one of the neighbor boys' houses, and she said no. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because I hear that they don't do nice things over there and their parents aren't watching them. And I said, well, don't you trust me? And she said, well, I don't know. She protected me and kept me from doing things that would hurt me because my level of righteousness or my good behavior, she thought, wasn't strong enough to overcome the temptations that I would encounter when I was over at this friend's house. In the gospel reading today, in chapter 7 of Luke, it says, soon afterward, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. And he came and touched the coffin, and the bearers stood still. Now, what's beautiful about that, and what we don't catch right away, is that the real point of this is that he reached out and he touched that coffin. That's something that's unclean. That's something that the Pharisees wouldn't do, and Jesus wasn't expected to do it. But Jesus is the one who does not define himself in terms of what he will not do, but what he will do. And his righteousness overcomes the unrighteousness in the world. His holiness overcomes the uncleanness of this world. In the course of everyday living, we're going to come in contact with people that don't believe what we believe. They maybe do things we wouldn't do, and we have to be prudent about that. But we don't have to be afraid of interacting with the world. In the gospel reading, we see Jesus reaches out and he touches the unclean. And he does this on a number of occasions. To be called to those who are unclean or those that the world does not find attractive is kind of like being a doctor and you have the remedy for an illness, but you're not allowed to touch the patient. We are allowed to interact with the world and to bring the gospel to the world and that resurrection power of Jesus to the world. We are identified by what we do with Christ. We are the separate ones, but we're separated for the works of God and to continue on with the mission of Jesus. So this year, everybody that you meet, don't be afraid to reach out and touch their life.